The Sunday Times newspaper reported that President Cyril Ramaphosa and other passengers travelled at huge cost on an SAA passenger jet to the SADC summit in Kinshasa last week because none of the Air Force VIP fleet is serviceable. But the Defence Department has reportedly said this is because Inkwazi and other executive aircraft are currently out of commission, and the SAA quote was the cheapest one from those sourced. This comes, of course, at a time when there are ongoing concerns about the state of the Army's finances. Now, let's speak more on this and speak to Darren Oliver, who's the director at Africa Defence Review. Darren, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I mean, you read this and it's a litany of articles that we've seen when, talking about the state of what the SANDF is looking like. Let's start with the implications of the grounding of Inkwazi and the fact that the monthly subscription fees have not been paid to update the flight database. What does this all mean? Darren, I think you're on mute.
My apologies, yes. Obviously, it means things aren't well in the SANDF as a whole, and the Air Force in particular. This is a database that should not have been left alone at all. It's something that gets renewed every 3 years. It's like clockwork. It's something that's required for all, not only the VIP aircraft, but any Air Force aircraft that has to fly around the country or around the world, really, in controlled airspace, needs to have up-to-date aeronautical navigational data. And one of these provided by companies like Jefferson, which is a company in this case that the contract wasn't renewed. Now, this is partially because of, really, a comedy of errors between Treasury and the DoD. The Air Force did renew it. They sent through all the paperwork for this and, arranged the budget in time. But there's been just a complete hold-up between the DoD and Treasury as to how to handle tenders. This stems partially from a moratorium on tenders that the Treasury created back in March, first February, and then all the way through to May. But also, it's just an ongoing conflict between the DoD and Treasury around all kinds of things and around how to fund a department that, as you said, is increasingly just struggling under a budget that is far too small for the task placed upon it. So, this is, I think, just emblematic of a deeper and broader problem. It's not only funding. Funding, of course, is the major problem here. The SANDS budget, for example, has gone from being 6% of government spending to less than 1% now. It's gone from being, 1.5% of GDP to less than 1% now as well. So you have this declining budget in real terms over the years, yet the number of missions and tasks placed upon the SANDF, such as helping the police, have only grown. So what you have is a force that's severely stretched. It's understaffed at the moment compared to its current mandate. And of course, things are now falling through the cracks.
And we talk about, these contracts as, you tell us about the difficulties when it comes to some of these tenders. Let's look at the state of the contract renewal decisions then in the Air Force at the moment. If, what you're saying then is really at the heart of what is going on, it means then those that are in charge of renewing these contracts are essentially having their hands tied.
Yes. So let me explain the process in general. How it works is that a department in let's say the Air Force, for example, in this case, the Director of Air Safety, has a requirement for a contract for data. So what they do is they then prepare the requirement, they create the documents for the tender, they arrange the budget, they then send through the requirement to the CPSC, the Central Procurement Service Center of the DoD that handles all centralized procurement for the entire force. So in this case, my understanding from my own sources is that this all happened. In enough time, they did the paperwork, they got the budget in place, they sent the request through, and it got stuck there. First, of course, because of the moratorium, and second, because there's now a process to apply for exemptions. And from what my sources are telling me, that process has broken down. So this affects, by the way, not only this contract. It affects contracts for fuel and for all kinds of other things as well, and fuel spare parts and other things. So it's an ongoing and deeper issue around procurement right now in the SANDF. Along with this, you also have a requirement that, like any government procurement, there's a certain amount of local content requirements, BE requirements, and those make sense in many cases, but there are cases in the DoD in particular where you have only a single source for an item, and that source might be a foreign OEM. Now, technically speaking, there is an approach available in the PFMA and other laws to allow you to nonetheless still source those contracts from a foreign supplier without needing to apply any of those additional requirements. But I'm also told that process isn't quite working properly at all.
At the same time, then, as we talk about these difficulties with the contracts, you then are looking at the amount of money that has been spent here. And they say that, of course, this was the lowest, quote when it comes to, the president's plane. But at the same time, this is a department that has been flagged when it comes to not having a control over its own expenditure. So it really boggles the mind then to say if they don't have control over their own spending and then they're now being forced to then spend this much money, it really brings things into a bit of a messy situation, more messier than what we've seen, particularly when it comes to the finances as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is a matter of trust as well. How can the public trust the DoD to do what's right if we see these reports about so much irregular spending? What this comes down to is that there isn't enough consequence management. There aren't enough personnel who are properly trained in procurement and auditing. And there isn't enough coordination from the very top to ensure it happens. So in this case, I really blame the Secretary of Defense, who's obviously the Chief Financial Officer in the DoD, and the Minister of Defense for not really, I think, making this the priority. Above all else, you have to make sure that your finances are correct, that you're spending the right amounts, that your tenders and your processes are above board. And what you really have, again, is a case where the SANDF is losing the capacity. I mean, it's being held together by a bunch of overworked colonels at the moment, many of whom are not properly trained for the role they're in. And, of course, with further cuts in personnel, many of those posts are being further reduced, meaning people are doing 2 or 3 jobs at once. So this is really, again, I agree with you, it's a major issue that should be resolved from the very, very top. And currently, there's just no urgency for that.
So, at the, when you really look at what has been happening, I mean, you're seeing reports suggesting that 75%, for example, of the aircraft are grounded due to a lack of spare parts and fuel. And we talk about some of the difficulties around these contracts. And yet, when you look at ground level, there are people who have been protesting, calling for the army to come to their communities and say that this is the only way that they can get a handle on crime. If there are all these challenges that the SANDF is facing, what does it then mean for the people on the ground who are calling for the army? Is this a need that they can meet?
No. Simply put, there's no way the army can meet this need. It is already overstretched. This aside from the fact that these problems are something you can need to solve through policing, especially around detective intelligence work, which the SANDF is actually banned from doing, as part of the separation of the army and the police, or the military and the police. But no, I mean, what you have really is a force-stretched breaking point. There's a need to have a complete rethink of the SANDF's budget and purpose in society. I think nothing less than a brand new defense review. Our last one was in 2015 and was completely unrealistic. So there's a need to sit back and do a full policy review and say, well, what do we need the SANDF for? What are the must-have missions that it must be able to fulfill? And how much can we spend on it? And obviously, we know the answer is we can't spend very much. The country is going through tons of issues, which means we need to shrink the SANDF even further. It's a very painful choice, but it also means the SANDF can do much less.
And of course, you talk about the defense review, and you say when one even reads it, it talks about scaling back on some of the ambitions. But how much of a vulnerable position then does this put South Africa in if our own defense force is in this kind of state?
Very vulnerable. And it won't hit us now, it'll hit us in 10 to 15 years. I mean, already we've come close to a disaster, as we saw in July last year with the riots, where the army had to literally, go to the back of the cupboard, pulling out anybody who could walk and hold a gun onto the streets. There were reserves called up who had never been called up for decades. There were, cooks and engineers and people who aren't traditionally infantry put out there on the streets. It was very much a last gasp effort. And if it hadn't been big enough, we'd have been in real trouble. But even going further ahead, our Gripens, which is our sole air defense capability, has been grounded for over a year now. They're still not flying. Our borders are increasingly difficult to patrol because we have so few troops on the border. Only 2,500 troops, and we can't send any more. And of course, any new requirement, like sending troops to Mozambique, having more to support the police, means that there are fewer troops available to rotate around and to keep available in the event of emergencies. So yes, at current trends, we're at a point where we'll be unable to fulfill most missions within 10, 15 years.
Sure. That's quite startling to even hear. Thank you so much for your time, Darren. I do appreciate it. That was Darren Oliver, Director at Africa Defence Review.